Hey everyone, Brady from Texturelabs.org here with an Adobe After Effects tutorial. If you're familiar with the channel, we've spent a lot of time in Photoshop, but almost everything I do professionally is in motion graphics, so I thought it might be fun to build this burning embers fire transition. We've got a glowing edge, some ashy embers, a little bit of smoke, some heat distortion, and all of this is native After Effects, no third-party plugins. We're gonna do it the old-fashioned way and build each of these elements individually. I'm tempted to call this an advanced After Effects tutorial, but we're gonna start simple and then progressively build on some core concepts to create more and more detail. And we're gonna end up with a pretty concise project. Just 2 keyframes drive this whole thing. You can drop in any text or piece of artwork in here and this fire will kind of wrap around it and burn anything. Usually on the channel I try to put instructions on screen as we go, but I think in this case it's gonna be better if I try to diagram the project somehow in the description. So I'll do my best to do that. And if you want to download a project file, you can always do that by supporting Texturelabs.org on Patreon. All right, let's jump into After Effects and get started. All right, getting started in After Effects with a new composition. And I'm just going to use this HD 1080-24 preset and make this about 150 frames long. And we'll call this main comp. All right, then the first thing I want is a new solid in here. I'm gonna make this black, and this is just gonna be a black background. Then I'm gonna hit Command or Control T for the text tool, and we'll get some type in here. This is a font called Castle Press #2. And as a matter of fact, I'm gonna get one more layer of text up here, make something a little bit smaller. That way we can see how this applies to multiple layers. And this other font is called Peace Sans. All right, then I'm going to shift select both of these text layers, not the background, just the text, and pre-compose these layers. So this pre-comp is going to be anything that we want to burn in this project. I'm going to call it Burn Objects, and then I'm actually going to double click on this pre-comp and just make one adjustment here. I'm going to add an adjustment layer. And on the adjustment layer, I'm going to use the Fractal noise filter with the contrast down at about 10, the brightness up at 30, and the scale turned way down to 3. That just gives the text like just a little bit of kind of a papery texture. All right, then back in the main comp, so pretty much everything about this effect is going to be driven by one matte, a black and white matte that'll kind of dictate the overall shape of the fire transition. I'm actually going to create this matte in a new composition because I'm going to use it a couple of different times. Let's call this Transition Matte, and in here I'm going to start with a new solid. I'll make it white. And kind of goes without saying, there's just a million ways to create a white to black transition. You could have a mask or do it with any number of effects. I'm going to use kind of a random effect in the stylize section, this CC burn film effect. It's nothing too fancy, but if I crank this burn setting from 0 to 100, it's actually kind of a cool transition. So let's keyframe this transition. I'll go to maybe the 30th frame. We'll have it start on the 30th frame. And hit the little stopwatch icon to set a keyframe with that value at 0, and then maybe we'll make this a 100 frame transition. So at frame 130 I will bring that burn value up to 100, and that'll create a new keyframe for us. So there's one thing about this transition that we don't need. It ends up going to transparent, and I just want it to go to black. So I could either put a black solid layer behind this or under this, or I'm just going to use the effect in the channel section, the solid composite effect set to black, and that'll basically put a black background behind it. All right, I'm also going to take this layer and I'm going to scale the entire layer up 200%. I actually don't want it to be too detailed, and I also like that when it's scaled way up like this, I can kind of move the layer around so that the transition doesn't necessarily start right in the middle. It can kind of go from left to right. What we can also do is change the random seed on this effect. It'll just give us different versions of the transition, so maybe there's something else we like a little bit better, but something like that. All right, then to convert this from a very soft transition to a high contrast edge, I'm going to put an adjustment layer on top. This is going to be pretty lo-fi. I'm just going to use in the color correction effects the brightness contrast effect, And I do need to click on this Use Legacy checkbox in order to crank the contrast really, really high. I'm going to go to 99%. 100% would create just absolute black and white values, but it gives you a little bit of that anti-aliasing, and so 99 is just going to create just enough of a soft edge there. All right, so we've got this high contrast white to black transition, but we want to give it a little bit more character. So I'm going to add a couple of things in here. First of all, underneath this adjustment layer, I'm going to create a new solid, and it doesn't matter what color this is. In fact, I'm going to make it really bright blue, and that just kind of helps me to keep track of it. And I'm going to call this Fractal Noise, and then on this layer, unsurprisingly, I'm going to use the Fractal Noise Effect. Then I'm going to set this layer to Overlay mode, and I'm just going to make one tweak to the fractal noise settings. In the transform section, I'm going to bring the scale up to 200%. And you can see how that gives the transition like an entirely new character. Of course, you can get super into dialing in the details on this fractal noise, but I think just bringing up the scale and leaving it at default works pretty well for now. It's kind of cool to see this super grungy transition, but I've actually found the effect turns out to look more realistic when it's a little bit more subtle, so I'm going to bring the opacity on this fractal noise layer down to just 25%. Then one more layer in here. What I'm going to do is drag this burn object Precomp that we created a minute ago, that was the typography, and I'm going to put this underneath the brightness contrast adjustment layer also, and also set this layer to overlay mode. And check this out, if I give this layer some blur, so I'm going to use Gaussian blur and bring that up to maybe 40, what that's going to do is make this burning edge almost kind of react to the edges of the type. So if you can imagine that this black to white or white to black is that fiery edge, it almost kind of wraps around and reacts to the letters as it goes. So that's basically the transition matte, and I'm going to do one more thing in here that for now is more just kind of a precaution. On this burn object layer, I'm going to add one more effect, and that is a hue saturation effect with the saturation pulled all the way down to -100. That's just in case the artwork or image or whatever is in this Precomp has any color in it. Color information is just going to kind of screw up the matte. You would end up with something that looks kind of like this. So I'm just going to leave this with saturation at -100 just to make sure this layer is only gray values. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, well that is the transition matte. Let's get back to the main comp and drag this matte in here. So I've got the burn object and the transition matte, and I'm basically going to use just these two elements, a few instances of them in different ways, to create all the different details of this burning effect. So we'll start with the simple one. What I want to do is use this white to black matte as a luma matte on the burn object layer. So as it transitions to black, it'll basically hide the layer. A simple way to do that would be to just define this as a luma matte for the layer underneath. But I'm going to opt for a slightly different approach that I think is going to make a little more sense for this project, and that's to use this effect, the set matte effect. And then here I'm going to use take matte from and point it to the transition matte and set it to luminance, which is basically the same as defining it as a luma matte. The benefit here is that I'm actually going to use this transition matte as a luma matte on several different elements, and rather than having to have a new copy of it every time to use as a luma matte, I could just have this one matte and refer to it with an effect anytime we want to use it. So that created the basic transition. Let's get into adding some details. The first one will be kind of a darkened, burned edge that travels along with the transition. And here's another benefit of using the set matte effect rather than the more standard luma matte, is that I can still use this layer. I can still turn it on, add some effects to it. I don't need to drag yet another copy in here. It's kind of one less layer to worry about. So let's keep this layer turned on, and actually I'm going to rename it, I'll call it Darken Burn, and I'm also going to put /transition matte. And that'll make sense later. We're still going to refer to this layer as the transition matte with some other effects. For now, I'm just going to give it a simple blur effect using fast box blur. Kind of a lo-fi blur, but it's nice and quick to render. I'm going to bring this up to 30 pixels and also turn on repeat edge pixels so it doesn't mess with the edges of the layer. Then I'm going to set this layer to linear burn mode, and then let's dial it in a little bit. I'm going to use a levels effect, and all I'm going to do on this is just drag the gamma up to about 0.6 just to kind of crush those blacks in a little bit. Then let's give this some burnt color using a hue saturation effect. I'll set it to colorize and take the hue to about 30 degrees. bring the saturation to 15 and the brightness also to 15. Cool, so that's our burned edge layer, kind of a nice simple detail. Let's move on to the next piece. Next up is going to be kind of the opposite of the burned edge. We'll create that sort of illuminated fiery edge that travels along with the transition. I'm going to drag another copy of the transition mat in here and rename this one Fire Edge. And on this layer, I'm going to start with two effects that are both in the channel section. The first is going to be just a simple invert effect. And the second is going to be the CC Composite Effect. And that'll take the original layer before the invert effect. And what we can do is set this to multiply. So we're basically inverting the layer, then multiplying the original back on top of itself. But what we could do is add another effect. We can insert an effect in here. I'm going to use Turbulent Displace. And if I drag this effect up in between the invert and the composite, basically any distortion that this turbulent displace creates is going to kind of peek out from behind the layer getting multiplied onto itself. I can quickly show you what this setup would look like if it was in a pre-comp by itself. You'd have the layer on the bottom with a turbulent displace, then another copy of the layer on top with an invert on it, and that layer set to multiply. And in some ways it might be more obvious to set it up like this with a pre-comp, but for me I always prefer to minimize the number of pre-comps I'm using, the number of layers I'm using. If I can keep everything in front of me in one place where I have all my controls, I found that to be a huge advantage. And I point this out because throughout this tutorial I'm going to use this same approach, using effects and some of the channel and matte tools whenever I can to try to keep the file really minimal, and that also makes it really easy to adjust. All right, in any case, we've got the basis of the fiery edge here, so let's dial in this turbulent displace setting a little bit. All I'm going to do is take the size of that effect down to 20. And I'm going to set this layer to add mode so we can see how it's looking. So we've got the shape of the burnt edge, and let's give this a little bit of an ashy texture. I'm going to use the Fractal noise filter, and I'll set the blending mode to multiply. And I'm just going to make a few changes to the default settings. I'll bring the contrast up to 200, the brightness down to -25, and then really crank up the detail by bringing the sub influence all the way up to 200. All right, then I need a matte for this layer so it just lives within the shapes of the letters, right? So let's use that set matte effect again and just point it to the burn objects layer. There we go. All right, then let's give it some glowy color, and I'm going to use one of these color correction effects, the tritone effect, and introduce a midtone color. I'm going to go kind of reserved on this color. It's tempting to make it really bright and saturated, but I'm going to go with a little bit more of a muted orange color. So that's hex code 8D3F18. Then for the highlight color, a yellow color, not too bright. That's going to be hex code FFDD83. And finally, why not some good old-fashioned glow with the glow effect. Let's crank the radius up to 50 and bring up the intensity just a little bit to 3. So that is our fire edge layer, and actually now that things are starting to come together, we're getting a sense of the shape of that transition. We can always go back and adjust maybe some of the specifics of where the transition starts. I'm going to go back to the transition mat layer. I just want to move this bottom layer, the film burn layer, over a little bit. I really want that transition to feel a little bit more from left to right rather than kind of splitting right up the middle. So let's see, yeah, probably something a little bit more like that. All right, next up we're going to step it up a little bit, get a little more complex, and create the smoke layer, kind of a subtle trailing smoke that follows this edge, and it's going to be kind of a variation on the same theme. I'm going to drag another instance of the transition mat in here and call this one smoke. And the idea is that, again, we're going to use the transition mat to reveal the layer and then to hide itself again, just like that burn or the fire edge layer. But the difference is, rather than this hard edge, I want it to be a really soft transition that kind of fades to black. So the first thing I'm going to use on here is an effect in the time section, the wide time effect. I'll set the forward steps to 0 and the backward steps to 20. And that effect kind of blends this transition across time, if that makes sense. So it's kind of echoing the 20 frames behind it and makes it look more like a smooth transition. All right, then we're going to set a matte for this layer, actually 2 mattes. First, I'm going to use the set matte effect, and point it at the burn object so it lives within the shapes of the letters. Then I'm going to use another instance of set matte, and on this one I'm going to point it at the transition matte. And I'm going to set this to luminance, and I'm also going to click on the invert matte option. And that means that the transition matte is going to reveal this smoke layer rather than hiding it. Let's first just blur the whole thing to make it a little bit more obscure. I'm going to use fast box blur and just set that to 10. And right now this layer is kind of a mixture of transparency and black and white, and I want it to just be black and white. That's going to help avoid some issues as we introduce other effects. So I'm going to quickly use in the channel effects a solid composite and just composite that layer on black. And then I'm going to set the layer to screen mode. Then let's start to create some smoky detail with the fractal noise effect. We're really going to put that effect to use today. I'm going to set its blending mode to multiply. And if it weren't for the solid composite that we just put in there, we would have ended up with some issues when setting fractal noise to multiply. It doesn't work well with transparency. So that was the reason for the solid composite. All right, let's dial in this fractal noise with some custom settings. I'm going to switch the fractal type to dynamic. Then in the transform section, bring the scale up to 300%. And when you bring up the scale, you lose some detail. So let's take the complexity up to 10, and that'll bring some detail back in. And then I'm going to adjust the sub settings. That'll make it look a little bit more smoky. I'm going to take the sub influence way up to 90%. Then the sub scaling to 65%. And then the sub rotation settings. This is an interesting thing about these sub settings using dynamic fractal noise. Changing the rotation totally changes how the fractal noise looks. And at about 100 degrees, it does give it this nice stringy smokiness. I think that is an Andrew Kramer trick, right? So thank you, sir. All right, then for only the second time in this whole video, we're going to animate something. Let's animate the evolution of this turbulent displace, and that'll get some swirliness happening. And I could keyframe this, but this is a good place to use an expression. That'll just make it swirl and swirl automatically. So what I'm going to do is Alt or Option click on the little stopwatch next to the evolution setting. And the expression here is going to be simple. It's going to be time times 200. And there we go. That's just going to drive the evolution based on the timeline. And I'm going to add just one more effect. We'll make it a little bit swirlier and smokier with a turbulent displace effect. And I'm just going to change the displacement style to twist and bring the size down to 30. All right, then after all that work, we're going to take this layer and bring the opacity down to just 20%. It's really, really subtle, more of a second or third read detail, but I really do think that that adds a lot to our fire transition. All right, we're getting closer. We're going to create one more element before doing some final compositing. This is going to be the most intense one, but I think it has the biggest payoff too. The embers layer, the fiery, ashy embers that look almost like particles. And the nice thing is that this is going to be a combo of many of the techniques that we've already used. So I think we are prepared. I'm going to start with the same thing, drag a copy of the transition matte in here. I'll call this one Embers. And same as on the smoke layer, I'm going to start with the CC wide time effect to kind of smooth it out. This time 0 forward steps and 60 backward steps. So it's a nice, long, smooth transition. A little slower to render since it is trying to take into account a full 60 frames of this layer. And with the wide time effect, there is one side effect. It's a little hard to tell, but it creates some transparency because it's still echoing from way back here before the layer was born. So what I'm going to do is use the solid composite effect and composite that against black. And that's for the same reason we use this on the smoke layer. The next effect is going to be the fractal noise effect. And just like the smoke layer, it's going to be set to multiply. So the solid composite is going to help avoid any weird artifacts with that multiply mode. Then in the fractal noise, I'm going to bring the contrast up to 220 and the brightness down to -90. Then in the transform settings, I'm going to take the scale down to 40%. And next, we're going to use a method here from much earlier in the tutorial that you might remember. The first half of this is that I'm going to blend this fractal noise effect just by bringing the opacity of this effect down to 50%. Then I'm going to add the brightness contrast effect. And earlier in the tutorial, we used this with legacy checked on. I'm going to do the same here. And we had it earlier at 99% to avoid any anti-aliasing. In this case, I'm going to need to bring it all the way to 100% to get rid of all the gray completely. It's okay for now that that's a little bit crunchy. And we can start to get a sense of how with this extreme contrast effect, these little ashy pieces, they don't fade out. As the matte moves across them, they kind of get crushed in from the outside in, like they're burning out rather than fading away. And it's been said that that is better. All right, in a sense, this is like a black and white matte for the ashes now, and we can bring some texture into them by using yet another instance of fractal noise. And again, this effect is going to be set to multiply blending mode. And here I'm going to bring the contrast to 200, and in the transform section, bring the scale way down to 10%. All right, next I'm going to try to get these ashes to kind of swirl and drift around and try to get them to look kind of like particles. Now the good news is that they burn out pretty quickly after they're revealed. So we're going to try to do it using the same method as the smoke layer, using the turbulent displace filter. I'm going to bring the size down to 50. And then we're going to create some animation for this turbulence using expressions again. This time we're going to animate two values. The first one is going to be the turbulence offset. I'll Alt or Option click on that little stopwatch, and the expression is going to be open bracket time times 65, comma 540, close bracket. And that expression will use time to animate the X value of the offset, and it'll just leave the Y value fixed at 540. All right, then one more expression, and this is actually going to be exactly the same as the smoke layer. It's going to be on the evolution value, and it's going to be the same one as earlier, time times 200. All right, so let's take a look at that. And obviously these things kind of wiggle around almost like they're going in little circles, but let's get some mattes on here and see how much we actually notice that. I'm going to use the set matte effect again and take the matte from the burn objects layer, keeping the ashes to just inside of the letters, and then another set matte. This one is going to point at the transition matte layer using the luminance channel and inverted. All right, and look at that. They kind of come on and burn out so fast that you never really notice that they're just going in circles. And finally, the easy part, we're going to give these some color. And actually, since I want these ashes to kind of connect to the fire edge layer down here, I'm just going to go down to that fire edge layer and copy both the tritone and the glow effect, and then paste those right onto the embers layer. And finally, I'm going to set this layer to screen mode. All right, well that wraps up the embers layer. That's all of our elements, but now there are a few overall effects that are really going to help elevate this thing. Now the only complicated one is going to be the first one, but it's a really cool effect. It's going to be a displacement map that kind of warps and bends things as they get lit on fire. So for a displacement map effect, we do need a layer for it to reference. So I'm going to drag in yet another copy of the transition matte, and I'll rename it displacement reference. And this will have just a few quick effects on it. First, I'm going to use a fast box blur and crank this up to 25. That's going to make the displacement kind of ramp in with that soft edge. Then I need to invert the whole thing with the invert effect. Then another channel effect, I'm going to use shift channels. And here I'm just going to switch the take alpha from, I'm going to set it to take it from the luminance. Then one more effect, I'm going to use the fractal noise effect to give this some light and dark variation. And the only setting I'm going to customize here is the complexity. I'm going to bring that down to 4, just make it an overall kind of softer noise pattern. All right, that's the displacement reference layer, and I can actually turn this layer off. We're just going to use it as a reference by adding a new adjustment layer on top and giving this layer the displacement map effect. I will point it to our displacement reference, and I do need to change this from source to effects and masks, meaning it'll take the blur and the fractal noise, all those effects into account when it creates the displacement, and give this a horizontal value of 20 and a vertical value of 10. All right, so that is a pretty subtle, but I think it's a really cool effect. Look at how on the smaller typography, it almost kind of gets warped and swept up by a little heat wave as it catches on fire. I think there's something to be said for all these subtle details that you don't really notice on their own, but when you put them all together over the course of just 100 frames, it really does make for a cool effect. All right, for the home stretch, I'm just going to run through a few final effects. I guess you could call them compositing or color correction effects, but a few things to kind of glue it together for a finished look. First of all, how about a little fade in? If you've made it this far in the tutorial, I bet you don't need an explanation on a fade in. I'm going to use a black solid and key the opacity from 100% on the first frame to maybe 0% on the 40th frame. Next, I want to give the whole thing just a tiny bit of a soft glow. So I'll put an adjustment layer on top, use Gaussian blur, crank it up to 200 pixels, switch it over to screen mode, and bring the opacity down to maybe just 15%. To me, that kind of gives a little bit of a sense of either atmosphere or maybe light bouncing around inside of the camera body. All right, one more adjustment layer and we'll just power through some final effects. First, let's give the whole thing just a little bit of a drift backward using, in the distort section, I'm just gonna use the transform effect. This is gonna be like the poor man's way to do it, but it'll work. I'm gonna go to the very first frame and in the transform effect, crank up the scale to maybe 110% and set a key here. Then go to where everything has faded out at frame 120 and key it back to 100%. Then for some effects to give it a little bit more of an analog camera look, I'm going to use the CC vignette effect. And there's not much happening near the edges, so I can crank that way up to 250. And that just gives a little bit of a subtle light fall off away from the center. Then for some film grain, rather than the add grain effect, which looks good, but it's super, super slow to render, I just like to use a regular noise effect, set it to 5%, then a Gaussian blur across the entire image, and that can be subtle. I'm going to set it to 2. And after that, this may seem counterintuitive, but after blurring it, I'm going to sharpen it back up with an unsharp mask effect. And I'll even bring the amount up to 100 and the radius up to 1.5. All right, and that is our effect. Looking pretty cool, and what I really like is that you could just drop whatever you want into this burn objects pre-comp and then basically just watch stuff burn. So I'm going to leave you with a little montage of various things put into this pre-comp and we'll see how they look. I hope you learned something interesting watching this tutorial, or at least enjoyed yourself along the way. Either way, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out the Texturelabs channel for more content and texturelabs.org for a ton of free assets. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.